This morning, police are investigating the murder of veteran character actor James Handy.
Hey, Mav.
The 81-year-old last appeared in Top Gun Maverick alongside Tom Cruise.
At 9:30 a.m. on June 3, 2026, a quiet residential pocket of Tarzana in Los Angeles was interrupted by a single emergency call that would soon pull detectives, paramedics, and media crews into an unfolding domestic tragedy. The 911 caller's voice, according to law enforcement officials, carried an unsettling mix of clarity and delusion, stating, "I am the Son of Man. I just killed the man of sin." He was being literal. He had indeed ended a life, that of a prominent Hollywood supporting actor. Only hours later, rumors began circling that Tom Cruise broke down in tears after what happened to James Handy. But what really happened that day, leading up to it, and ever since? Today, we'll uncover everything. Let's step into the heart of the tragedy once again. The final morning in Tarzana. When Los Angeles Police Department units arrived minutes later at the site, they found 81-year-old actor James Handy in the front yard of the property, unresponsive and suffering from a stab wound to the chest. The scene, described in early briefings as contained and not chaotic beyond the immediate area, suggested the violence had already concluded before officers reached the location. Emergency responders began life-saving measures on site before transporting him to a nearby hospital. But despite intervention, Handy was later pronounced dead. The suspect was quickly identified as a 44-year-old man who is the son of Handy's girlfriend. According to police accounts referenced in subsequent reporting, the suspect did not flee the scene in a conventional sense. Instead, surveillance and witness summaries indicate he remained in the vicinity after the stabbing and ultimately surrendered when officers arrived, effectively closing the immediate perimeter of the investigation within minutes of police arrival. Investigators classified the case early as an isolated domestic incident. That classification also narrowed the investigative focus toward household dynamics, relationship history, and any underlying tensions within the shared living arrangement. At this stage, authorities did not indicate evidence of additional suspects or external involvement. The violence had emerged internally within the household structure. Whatever had gone wrong had done so inside the household. Before we move any further with the details, let's take a look at the life of the deceased star, the man behind the credits. Born in New York City, James Handy emerged into acting in the late 1970s during the era of network soap operas and early television drama expansion, with early work including appearances tied to the Ryan's Hope television landscape, a period when daytime TV functioned as both training ground and pipeline for character actors entering Hollywood's larger machine. It was not a breakout moment in the modern celebrity sense, but rather the beginning of a long occupational trajectory that would define him less as a star and more as a permanent fixture in the background architecture of film and television. As his career progressed into the 1980s and 1990s, Handy became part of a very specific category of performer, the high-volume supporting actor whose presence could be deployed across genres without disrupting narrative tone. Over time, his screen credits accumulated into a body of work, estimated between 100 and 150 appearances across film and television. That number, while not headline-grabbing in isolation, reflects longevity in a field where most working actors cycle in and out of visibility within a few years. Handy, instead, remained consistently employed across shifting industry eras, from analog network television to high-budget studio cinema. Unlike leading actors whose careers are defined by franchise identity or marquee billing, Handy's professional identity was built on reliability. Casting directors repeatedly placed him in roles that required grounded authority or subtle narrative function, law enforcement figures, institutional professionals, and everyday men positioned within larger storylines. This consistency is what earned him the industry classification often described informally as a working actor. By the 1990s and early 2000s, his appearances became part of mainstream television's core ecosystem. He appeared in long-running and widely watched series such as NYPD Blue, ER, The West Wing, and Criminal Minds, all of which defined different phases of American broadcast television. Each of these shows operated at a significant cultural scale, with ER and The West Wing regularly drawing tens of millions of viewers at their peaks, while Criminal Minds extended procedural storytelling into the streaming transition era. His film work followed a similar pattern, threading through major studio productions that would later become part of pop culture memory. In Arachnophobia, directed by Frank Marshall, Handy played Pete, one of the residents of the small California town that gradually becomes the center of a deadly spider infestation. The film follows Dr. Ross Jennings, played by Jeff Daniels, as he discovers that a rare Venezuelan spider has bred with a local species, unleashing a growing threat across the community. Handy's role helped populate the town that serves as the film's battleground, contributing to the sense that ordinary people were unknowingly trapped in an escalating nightmare. Just a year later, Handy appeared in The Rocketeer, Disney's adaptation of Dave Stevens' comic book series. Set in 1938 Los Angeles, the film follows stunt pilot Cliff Secord, played by Billy Campbell, who discovers a stolen rocket pack and becomes an unlikely hero while battling gangsters and Nazi agents. Handy portrayed Wooly, one of the supporting figures operating within the criminal underworld that surrounds the story's central conflict. By 1995, Handy found himself in one of the decade's biggest family blockbusters, Jumanji. Starring Robin Williams, Bonnie Hunt, Kirsten Dunst, and Bradley Pierce, the film centers on a supernatural board game that unleashes jungle dangers into the real world. Handy played a police officer, one of several authority figures drawn into the increasingly chaotic events surrounding the game. As stampeding animals, giant insects, monsoons, and other hazards erupt throughout the town, law enforcement and local residents struggle to understand what is happening. Handy's role helped ground the story in reality by representing the institutional response to events that seem impossible. What makes these appearances particularly interesting is how they placed Handy inside stories that became larger than anyone could have predicted at the time. Arachnophobia evolved into a cult favorite, frequently revisited by horror fans. The Rocketeer became a beloved piece of superhero history. Jumanji transformed from a single-family adventure into a multi-generational franchise. More than 2 decades later, Handy's career intersected with another major cinematic milestone when he appeared in Logan. Directed by James Mangold and starring Hugh Jackman in his final performance as Wolverine, the film departed sharply from traditional superhero formulas. Set in a bleak, near-future America, Logan follows an aging and physically deteriorating Wolverine as he attempts to protect a young mutant named Laura while confronting both personal mortality and the collapse of the X-Men legacy. Handy played a doctor, a small but fitting role, within a story deeply concerned with aging, vulnerability, and the consequences of a lifetime of conflict. This continuity is what ultimately defines Handy's place in Hollywood history. He was not built around stardom cycles, award campaigns, or franchise ownership, but around repetition, dependability, and adaptability. Across 5 decades, he moved through changing production cultures, from film stock to digital sets, from episodic network TV to streaming-driven production models, without losing employability in any major phase. By industry standards, this type of career is statistically far more common than stardom, yet rarely documented with equal narrative weight. This point will become very relevant later on, but for now, let's look at the time when James Handy shared a screen with Tom Cruise. The Top Gun Maverick connection. When Top Gun Maverick began production, it was already being treated as one of the most carefully guarded legacy sequels in modern Hollywood, built around Tom Cruise's return to his most iconic role nearly 4 decades after the original 1986 film. Within that tightly controlled production environment, even small roles were cast through a system designed to blend authenticity with realism, mixing established actors, real naval personnel, and experienced character performers who could populate the world without pulling focus from the central narrative. James Handy's connection to that ecosystem came in the form of a minor but credited appearance where he portrayed a bartender named Jimmy. While the role itself is brief and functionally background level within the story, it placed him physically inside one of the most commercially significant film productions of the decade. The film, released after multiple pandemic-related delays, went on to earn over $1.4 billion worldwide, making it one of the highest-grossing films of 2022 and reaffirming Tom Cruise's position as one of the last remaining global box office anchors in theatrical cinema. Inside that larger machine, Handy's role was not designed for narrative prominence, but for environmental realism. Scenes involving naval bars, military gathering spaces, and transitional character moments often rely on actors whose job is to stabilize the world of the film rather than drive it forward. His appearance functioned as part of the film's atmospheric architecture. The significance of that credit only became more visible years later, not because of the role itself, but because of how Top Gun: Maverick evolved culturally after release. The film became a global box office event that outperformed expectations set for legacy reboots, particularly in the post-pandemic theatrical landscape, where audience behavior had become unpredictable. Even minor cast members became indirectly connected to one of Hollywood's most dominant commercial narratives. The film's extended life cycle, driven by repeated streaming resurgence, award season recognition, and global re-releases, kept its cast list in circulation far longer than typical blockbuster cycles. That sustained visibility is what later brought renewed attention to names like Handy, whose role would otherwise have remained a small credit. Tom Cruise's involvement further amplified that effect. As both lead actor and central producer, Cruise maintained unusual creative control over the project, shaping everything from stunt execution to production design standards. This level of authorship meant that every credited performer, no matter how small the role, became part of a tightly curated cinematic world associated directly with his career identity. What distinguishes Handy's participation from typical background casting is the way Top Gun: Maverick functions as a cultural reference point rather than just a film. Unlike smaller productions, its ensemble cast is frequently revisited in entertainment coverage, retrospectives, and franchise analysis, especially as discussions continue about potential sequels and the long-term future of the Top Gun brand. That means even brief appearances retain a form of residual visibility that extends beyond their original screen time. By 2026, when news cycles revisited James Handy's career following his death, the Top Gun: Maverick credit became one of the most widely cited touchpoints in global reporting. This is not because the role defined his career, but because it connected him to a film still actively present in popular culture memory. A lesser-known aspect of his life. Before his acting career fully began, James Handy served in the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War era, an experience that left a permanent mark on both his worldview and the types of roles he would later inhabit on screen. Drafted in his early 20s, Handy was deployed to Vietnam with the 196th Light Infantry Brigade, serving in Tay Ninh Province between August 1966 and July 1967, a period marked by intense ground combat operations during the broader escalation of U.S. involvement in the war. In later interviews, he described being thrust into sustained combat conditions that stretched over weeks in the field, recalling that at points the fighting was so continuous it blurred into routine survival rather than episodic battles. He spoke about the psychological disorientation of the environment, dense jungle terrain, near total darkness at night, and constant uncertainty about proximity to enemy positions. His recollections emphasized not only physical danger, but the sensory collapse of war itself, where visibility, orientation, and time perception were severely disrupted. He also described witnessing fellow soldiers killed or injured in close proximity. This experience shaped his later rejection of romanticized depictions of warfare in popular culture. After returning to the United States, Handy's experience in Vietnam did not fade into the background biography. It actively reshaped his political and moral outlook. He later identified as a pacifist, stating that his time in combat led him to believe the war had caused unnecessary suffering without meaningful justification. This shift was not abstract or symbolic. It influenced how he engaged with war narratives in film and television throughout his career. In interviews, he expressed strong discomfort with stylized or simplified portrayals of Vietnam-era combat, arguing that many screen depictions failed to reflect the psychological and moral complexity of what soldiers actually experienced. That personal history also informed one of his more quoted cultural critiques, where he openly rejected the tone of certain Vietnam-set films in popular cinema. He was particularly critical of Forrest Gump, arguing that its depiction of Vietnam-era service was unrealistic and softened in ways that, in his view, distorted historical truth. While his comments were controversial in tone, they reflected a consistent through line in his worldview, a resistance to the sanitization of war for entertainment purposes. After completing his military service, Handy eventually transitioned toward education and acting, but the war remained a formative reference point rather than a closed chapter. When he began appearing on screen in the early 1980s, his first credited role came in TAPS, a military academy drama centered on cadets who take over their school in response to its planned closure. The film itself dealt with themes of discipline, authority, and the psychological impact of military culture on young men. An environment where Handy's real-life experience likely informed his understanding of institutional hierarchy and conflict, even though his role was limited. Across later decades, that background added a layer of credibility to many of the authority figures and law enforcement characters he frequently portrayed. While casting decisions in Hollywood rarely rely explicitly on veterans' biographies, character actors with lived military experience often bring an internal realism to procedural or command-based roles. In Handy's case, this extended into a long career of portraying sheriffs, officers, and institutional figures across film and television, from NYPD Blue and The X-Files to major studio films like The Rocketeer and Jumanji. His trajectory from combat soldier to working actor is part of a broader but less frequently highlighted pattern in American entertainment history, where Vietnam veterans transitioned into media careers. Now let's see what actually happened that fateful day. The domestic collapse, relationship, household, and the suspect. At 81, James Handy was living in Tarzana with his longtime partner, Wendy Gledhill. Although never legally married, their relationship was, for all practical purposes, a domestic partnership, and neighbors consistently described them as a stable, familiar couple who had settled into a quiet residential life. Wendy's adult son, Michael Gledhill, also lived in the home. In criminological research, this kind of multi-adult household, especially where caregiving, dependency, and mental health needs overlap, is often identified as a structurally elevated risk environment when serious psychiatric illness is present. Family systems theorists describe such homes as emotionally compressed spaces where boundaries become blurred and stress is continuously absorbed rather than externally resolved. As psychologist Murray Bowen's family systems theory suggests, chronic emotional tension in tightly bound households can lead to instability when one member's psychological functioning deteriorates. According to police accounts, the immediate incident began with a 911 call in which the caller stated, "I am the Son of Man, I just killed the man of sin," followed by officers arriving at the residence and discovering Handy critically injured outside. The phrase sounds like a religious statement, but in practical terms, it is not a normal biblical quote or a structured confession. Son of Man is a term found in the Bible, often used to refer to human beings, or in Christian theology, Jesus himself in a symbolic sense. Man of sin, on the other hand, comes from the New Testament, more specifically 2 Thessalonians 2:3, and is usually interpreted as a symbolic figure representing extreme moral corruption or rebellion against God. In isolation, both phrases exist in religious language, but the way they are combined here does not form a standard theological sentence. In real-world criminal investigations, when a suspect uses language like this during or immediately after a violent act, it is usually treated as symbolic or distorted speech rather than literal meaning. It often reflects the person's mental or emotional state at the moment, confusion, delusion, or an attempt to frame their actions in a moral or spiritual narrative. Importantly, it is not taken as evidence that the victim actually represents anything like sin in a real-world sense. Investigators focus instead on psychological conditions, stress triggers, substance influence, if any, or underlying mental health issues that could explain why the suspect is using religious imagery to describe violence. There is also a broader pattern in some homicide cases where suspects adopt religious or symbolic language after committing violent acts. In certain documented incidents over the years, individuals have described victims as evil, demons, or sinful, or have framed their actions as a kind of purification or mission. For example, in some cases of psychosis-related violence, suspects have believed they were acting under divine instruction or fighting a moral battle that only exists in their perception. In others, particularly rare but high-profile cases, perpetrators have used religious justification after the fact to rationalize actions that were driven by personal conflict, paranoia, or breakdowns in perception. What is important in these situations is that law enforcement and forensic psychologists do not interpret such statements at face value. A phrase like this does not establish motive in a legal sense. Instead, it becomes one piece of behavioral evidence used to understand the suspect's mindset. Investigators typically compare it with physical evidence, prior interactions between the individuals involved, witness statements, and any history of mental health concerns. Clinical psychiatrist Dr. Ronald W. Pies has written in his work on psychosis, delusions are fixed false beliefs held with extraordinary conviction despite clear evidence to the contrary. And in acute episodes, those beliefs can become tightly fused with perceived moral or cosmic narratives. In cases like this, experts caution against simplistic interpretations, emphasizing that psychotic symptoms can fluctuate rapidly and become more severe when medication adherence stops abruptly. Wendy Gledhill later stated that her son had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had discontinued his medication shortly before the incident. This aligns with well-established clinical research identifying medication discontinuation as a significant relapse risk factor in schizophrenia spectrum disorders. A frequently cited meta-analysis in Schizophrenia Bulletin has shown that relapse rates rise substantially within months of stopping antipsychotic treatment, particularly in individuals with a history of acute psychotic episodes. However, mental health professionals consistently stress a crucial distinction. Schizophrenia itself does not predict violence. Large-scale epidemiological studies, including those summarized by the National Institute of Mental Health and the MacArthur Violence Risk Assessment Study, show that most individuals with schizophrenia are not violent and are more likely to be victims than perpetrators. Where risk does increase, it tends to cluster in narrow, conditional circumstances. Forensic psychiatrists often identify a convergence of factors such as untreated psychosis, paranoia, substance use, social isolation, and perceived interpersonal threat within confined living environments. In this case, neighbors' descriptions of Michael Gledhill's withdrawn behavior, occasional paranoia, and inconsistent engagement with others resemble what clinicians refer to as functional decline indicators, though retrospective behavioral observations are not diagnostic. Criminologist James D. Densley, who studies violent domestic environments, notes that escalation is rarely linear. It is often the product of accumulating stressors interacting with untreated mental health conditions in closed systems with limited external interruption. Domestic homicide researchers also emphasize the structural differences between partner-based domestic violence and parent-adult-child cohabitation cases involving mental illness. Unlike romantic partner violence, these environments often lack external monitoring, meaning deterioration can remain internalized for extended periods. Over time, caregivers may adapt to unusual or escalating behaviors to preserve household stability. This adjustment is not usually a single conscious decision. It happens gradually. Small disturbance that would once be treated as serious warning signs start being interpreted as just how things are, because responding to each one with maximum urgency becomes emotionally exhausting and practically unsustainable. This is where the concept often referred to in research as normalization of deviance becomes relevant. Originally developed in organizational psychology, it describes how repeated exposure to abnormal but non-immediately catastrophic behavior can slowly reset what a person considers normal. Alongside this is a related dynamic studied in family systems theory: gradual desensitization to risk signals. When people live in close proximity, especially in emotionally complex relationships, they often prioritize short-term stability over long-term uncertainty. This can look like avoiding confrontation to prevent escalation, minimizing incidents to preserve peace, or rationalizing behavior as situational rather than structural. Over time, this creates a kind of psychological baseline shift where the threshold for what feels alarming steadily rises. In fact, Wendy described her son and Handy having a cordial relationship despite occasional tension. This fits perfectly within this pattern of coexistence under strain, where risk signals may not be perceived as imminent until a sudden critical rupture occurs. On the surface, cordiality suggests functional interaction, basic politeness, shared space management, and the absence of constant open conflict. But underlying strain can still exist: intermittent disagreements, unpredictable mood shifts, or episodes that are disruptive but not severe enough to trigger external intervention. The key issue is not whether tension exists, but whether it is interpreted as stable risk or manageable background noise. When caregivers or household members operate in this in-between space for extended periods, they may unconsciously develop coping strategies that prioritize continuity. This can include compartmentalizing incidents, such as saying, "That was just a bad day," attributing behavior to external stressors rather than internal escalation, or waiting for a third-party resolution that never arrives. These strategies are psychologically protective in the short term, but they can also reduce sensitivity to escalation cues that would otherwise prompt action. This slow adjustment can continue until a single triggering event breaks the system entirely. From the outside, that event appears sudden. Internally, however, it often represents the endpoint of a long chain of overlooked or reinterpreted signals. This is why researchers often emphasize that many domestic violence or intra-household critical incidents are not truly unpredictable, but rather the result of cumulative normalization processes that obscure risk over time. Another factor frequently highlighted in psychiatric caregiving literature is caregiver burden. The American Psychological Association has documented that long-term caregivers of individuals with severe mental illness experience elevated rates of chronic stress, sleep disruption, and emotional exhaustion. In multi-role households where a caregiver is simultaneously managing a partner relationship and a mentally ill adult child, this burden can become fragmented and difficult to manage. Researchers sometimes describe this as role overload, where competing emotional responsibilities reduce the caregiver's capacity to detect or respond to early warning signs. In some cases, families experience what clinicians call crisis fatigue, a pattern in which repeated instability leads to delayed intervention or normalization of escalating symptoms until a breaking point occurs. From a trauma psychology perspective, Wendy Gledhill's position is uniquely complex. She is simultaneously the long-term partner of the victim and the mother of the accused, a configuration clinicians sometimes describe as a dual loyalty trauma conflict. In such cases, grieving processes become psychologically contradictory, often producing cognitive dissonance, emotional numbing, and prolonged grief responses. Trauma specialist Dr. Bessel van der Kolk has noted in broader contexts that when individuals are exposed to emotionally incompatible realities, the mind can oscillate between disbelief and fragmentation as it attempts to integrate irreconcilable experiences. Wendy's reported statements expressing love for both men, disbelief, and shock are consistent with this type of acute trauma response. Neighborhood observations reported in the aftermath also align with criminological discussions of ambient warning signs in domestic settings preceding violent incidents. Behaviors such as aimless walking, dishevelment, or social withdrawal are often retrospectively interpreted as indicators of functional decline, though experts emphasize that such signs are not predictive on their own. The key limitation, as forensic clinicians repeatedly stress, is that without contemporaneous clinical assessment, such behaviors remain nonspecific. Legally, the case has proceeded into early-stage homicide prosecution with notable procedural emphasis on mental competency. Authorities arrested 44-year-old Michael Gledhill and charged him with crime, along with an allegation of personal use of a deadly weapon, a knife. He did not appear at his initial arraignment in Los Angeles Superior Court, and no plea was entered. His attorney informed the court that jail authorities had not transported him to proceedings, though no explanation was provided publicly. In response, Superior Court Judge John H. Reed ordered that Gledhill undergo evaluation through mental health court mechanisms to determine competency to stand trial. Mental health courts, as established in U.S. criminal justice reform literature, exist specifically to address cases where severe mental illness may impair a defendant's ability to participate meaningfully in legal proceedings. Forensic evaluators typically assess reality testing, cognitive coherence, understanding of charges, and capacity to assist counsel. As legal scholar Christopher Slobogin notes, competency standards are not about guilt or innocence, but about ensuring the fairness and rationality of adversarial process in the presence of mental disorder. If a defendant is found incompetent, they are referred for treatment aimed at restoring competency before trial can proceed. Investigators have also indicated that Gledhill told responding officers that he was the person they were looking for, and his bail was set at approximately $2 million. The case remains in a preliminary stage legally, but its human dimension is already fully formed. However, the reaction from Tom Cruise has been rather shocking. The shocking Hollywood reaction. Colleagues and fans emphasized the abruptness of the loss and the violent circumstances surrounding it, particularly given his age and career stage. His final public appearance was years earlier, yet his work continued to circulate widely through film and television, ensuring a form of cultural presence that extended beyond his active career. However, Hollywood's response was rather limited. The absence of instant high-profile statements stood out less as an anomaly and more as a reflection of how the industry consistently differentiates between leading figures and long-serving character actors. Despite sharing a film connection with James Handy, Cruise did not, contrary to the rumors, issue any public statement regarding Handy's death. Not a single word. This gap between speculation and documentation became increasingly relevant as online platforms filled the silence with fabricated content. Short-form videos circulating on TikTok and similar platforms began presenting AI-generated or digitally manipulated clips purporting to show Tom Cruise speaking emotionally about Handy, including claims of personal conversations or prior knowledge of his troubles. These videos are all fake. The documented response remained far more restrained. Industry observers note that this subdued visibility is consistent with how Hollywood typically responds to the deaths of working character actors. Tributes in such cases often occur through private messages, union acknowledgments, or behind-the-scenes conversations rather than public statements from top-billed stars. Tom Cruise's name inevitably becomes part of the story, even in the absence of any confirmed involvement. But the factual record remains narrow and clear. There is no verified statement from Cruise, no documented emotional response, and no credible report of public mourning specific to Handy. This ultimately exposes a deeper imbalance in how recognition operates. Performance actors like Handy build careers across hundreds of roles that sustain entire productions, yet their visibility often depends on association rather than prominence. When those careers end, the industry response is often silence. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.